Two pale faces pressed against the cold glass of a tower window in the summer of 1483. Two young boys, their breath fogging the ancient pain, stared out at a London that would soon forget them. Then one day, the faces vanished. The window stood empty. The boys were never seen again. They were not just any children. They were Edward V, 12 years old and rightful King of England, and his brother Richard of York, just 9 years old. Sons of the late King Edward IV, they had been placed in the Tower of London for their own protection, or so they were told. The Tower, after all, was a royal residence where monarchs traditionally stayed before their coronation. Young Edward should have been measuring himself for a crown. Instead, he and his brother were being measured for their tombs. What happened within those stone walls remains one of history's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. Did someone murder these innocent boys? Were they smothered in their sleep, their small bodies hidden beneath the cold stairs of the White Tower? Or did they somehow escape, vanishing into obscurity while England descended into chaos? For more than 5 centuries, historians have searched for answers, but the truth remains locked in the past, as impenetrable as the tower walls themselves. The Tower of London had already seen rivers of royal blood by 1483. Its stones were stained with executions, betrayals, and murders. Kings and queens, nobles and traitors had all met their end within its walls. But the disappearance of these two princes would become its darkest legend, a mystery that would haunt the British monarchy forever. 5 suspects emerge from the shadows of history. The first is the most obvious, the man who had everything to gain from their deaths, their uncle, Richard III, who seized the throne for himself. Then there are the shocking alternatives. Henry VII, who defeated Richard and founded the Tudor dynasty, desperate to eliminate rival claimants. The Duke of Buckingham, Richard's closest ally, who turned traitor. Even the boy's own mother has faced suspicion. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the possibility that no one murdered them, that they died of illness or escaped entirely, leaving behind only ghosts and speculation. The mystery begins now. The spring rain hammered against the palace windows as King Edward IV lay dying in his chambers at Westminster. It was April of 1483, and the mighty Yorkist king, the man who had clawed his way to the throne through rivers of blood and years of savage warfare, was slipping away at just 40 years old. His body, once powerful and commanding, had been ravaged by what chroniclers delicately called excesses. Too much wine, too much food, too much of everything that made life at the English court a spectacle of indulgence. But as Edward's breath grew shallow and his physicians exchanged knowing glances, the real concern wasn't the king's impending death. It was what would happen the moment his heart stopped beating. England in 1483 was a powder keg wrapped in silk and velvet. The Wars of the Roses, that catastrophic dynastic struggle between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, had already consumed a generation. The White Rose and the Red Rose had trampled England's fields with armies, stained its rivers with noble blood, and fundamentally altered the concept of what royal succession meant. This wasn't some distant medieval conflict fought with codes of chivalry and honor. This was brutal, intimate violence where brothers killed brothers, fathers condemned sons, and the definition of treason shifted with every change of power. Edward himself had seized the throne in 1461, deposing the mentally unstable Henry VI. But Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, a Frenchwoman with the heart of a warrior, had refused to accept defeat. She had rallied armies, made impossible alliances, and watched her young son die on the battlefield at Tewkesbury. When Edward finally secured his crown, he had done so by destroying entire bloodlines. Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London, almost certainly on Edward's orders. The official story claimed the deposed king died of pure displeasure and melancholy, but everyone knew the truth. You didn't leave loose claimants to the throne alive, not if you wanted to sleep soundly. And now Edward was dying, leaving behind 2 young sons. Edward, Prince of Wales, was just 12 years old. His brother Richard, Duke of York, was 9. 2 boys who had known nothing but the luxury of being royal princes, sheltered and educated and groomed for power, were about to be thrust into the most dangerous game in medieval Europe. The king's deathbed was crowded with nobles, each calculating their position in the coming storm. Edward's wife, Elizabeth Woodville, stood at the bedside, her beautiful face a mask of controlled terror. She was No fool. As a woman who had risen from relative obscurity to become Queen of England through her beauty and ambition, she knew exactly how precarious her position was. Her family, the Woodvilles, had been elevated to positions of immense power during Edward's reign, and they had made enemies of almost everyone at court. The old nobility despised them as upstarts. The king's own brothers had schemed against them. And speaking of the king's brothers, there was the real source of Elizabeth's fear, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's youngest surviving brother, a man who had stood loyally by the king's side through every battle and betrayal of the last 20 years. Richard was in the north, governing the wild border regions with an iron fist, when word reached him of his brother's deteriorating condition. He began the long ride south immediately, but the roads were muddy and the journey slow. Edward knew he was running out of time. With his last strength, he had forced the rival factions at his court to swear oaths of loyalty to his young son, to promise they would work together for the good of the realm. He named a council of regency to govern until Prince Edward came of age. But these oaths, sworn over a dying man's bed, were worth less than the breath used to speak them. Medieval England had seen too many regency councils torn apart by ambition. Royal minorities were times of chaos, periods when the usual rules evaporated and raw power was all that mattered. The king died on the 9th of April, 1483. The news spread through London like wildfire. Church bells tolled, proclamations were read, and behind closed doors, the various factions began to move. The Woodvilles struck first. Elizabeth's brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, was with the young Prince Edward at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, where the boy had been sent to learn the arts of kingship. Rivers immediately began preparations to bring the prince to London for his coronation, gathering an armed escort that looked more like an army. The message was clear. The Woodvilles intended to control the new king, and through him, control England. But Richard of Gloucester had his own ideas. He intercepted the prince's party at Stony Stratford, a small town in Buckinghamshire, on the last day of April. What happened next was a masterclass in political theater. Richard arrived with smiles and courtesy, greeting his nephew warmly, paying proper respect to the new king. And then, with swift efficiency, he arrested Earl Rivers and several other Woodville supporters, charging them with plotting to exclude him from his rightful role as protector of the realm and the king's person. The young Edward, suddenly surrounded by his uncle's men, his own guards dismissed or arrested, could do nothing but watch. He protested the arrest of Rivers, whom he loved as a tutor and friend, but a 12-year-old boy's protests meant nothing against armed men and political necessity. Richard assured his nephew that everything was being done for his own safety, that there had been dangerous plots, that the Woodvilles could not be trusted. The boy had no choice but to believe him, or at least to pretend to. In London, Elizabeth Woodville heard the news and knew immediately what it meant. She had been through enough court intrigue to recognize a coup when she saw one. With her younger son Richard and her daughters, she fled to Westminster Abbey, claiming sanctuary. The ancient right of sanctuary meant that even the king's men couldn't drag them out by force, not without committing sacrilege. She barricaded herself in the abbot's quarters, surrounded by loyal servants, and waited to see what would happen next. Richard brought the young king to London in early May, and the city received them with carefully orchestrated pageantry. Edward was installed in the royal apartments at the Tower of London, which at that time was not yet the sinister prison it would become, but rather a traditional residence for monarchs, preparing for their coronation. The date was set for the 22nd of June. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to proper form. But behind the scenes, Richard was consolidating power with ruthless efficiency. Earl Rivers and the other arrested Woodvilles were being held in northern castles, far from any help. Richard had himself officially named Lord Protector of the realm, giving him legal authority over the young king, and he was carefully cultivating support among the nobles and the London merchants, portraying himself as the only man strong enough to prevent civil war, the only man who could protect England from Woodville ambition and incompetence. Then came the critical moment. Richard convinced Elizabeth Woodville to release her younger son from sanctuary, promising the boy would join his brother in the Tower so the two wouldn't be lonely. It took weeks of negotiation, of veiled threats and solemn promises, but eventually Elizabeth relented. Perhaps she believed Richard's assurances. Perhaps she simply had no other choice. On the 16th of June, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, joined his brother in the Tower. Now Richard of Gloucester had both boys in his custody, and suddenly the political situation shifted dramatically. On the 22nd of June, the day that should have been Edward V's coronation, a prominent preacher named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at Paul's Cross in London. He announced that the late King Edward IV had been secretly married to another woman before his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, making his marriage to Elizabeth invalid and bigamous. This meant their children were illegitimate. They had no claim to the throne. The only legitimate heir to the House of York was Richard of Gloucester himself. The claim was almost certainly fabricated, based on rumors and half-truths that couldn't be proven or disproven. But truth mattered less than power. An assembly of lords and commons, carefully selected and managed by Richard's supporters, formally petitioned Richard to take the throne. He made a show of reluctance, of only accepting out of duty to the realm. But on the 6th of July, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III. The two princes, Edward and Richard, remained in the Tower. At first, they were seen occasionally, playing in the gardens, shooting arrows at targets. But as the summer wore on, sightings became rarer. By autumn, no one saw them at all. Rumors began to spread through London, whispered in taverns and markets. The boys were dead. They had been murdered, smothered in their beds, stabbed, poisoned. The details varied, but the conclusion was always the same. This was the world of late medieval England, where the crown was worth any crime, where family bonds dissolved in the face of political ambition, where children born to royalty were never safe because they represented threats or opportunities or obstacles to be removed. The Wars of the Roses had normalized political murder, made it almost expected. When you seized power, you eliminated rivals. That's how it worked. Henry VI had been killed. His son had been killed. Countless nobles had been executed after battles or attainted by parliaments and legally murdered. Royal children were particularly vulnerable because they couldn't fight back, but represented enormous symbolic power. Whoever controlled them controlled legitimacy. And if they couldn't be controlled, they had to be eliminated. It was brutal calculus, the mathematics of survival in a world where weakness meant death and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Whether Richard III actually ordered the murder of his nephews remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. But the context, the world that made such a murder not only possible, but almost inevitable, that we know with terrible certainty. It was a world soaked in blood, where the greatest danger came not from foreign enemies, but from your own family, where trust was foolish and ruthlessness was wisdom, where two young boys could vanish from the face of the earth and barely cause a ripple because everyone understood that this was how power worked, how succession happened, how crowns changed hands in the brutal summer of 1483. In the summer of 1483, two young boys vanished from the face of the earth, and the most powerful man in England had everything to gain from their disappearance. The question that has haunted historians for more than 5 centuries is deceptively simple. Did Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who became King Richard III, murder his own nephews to secure his grip on the throne? To understand why Richard stands as the prime suspect in this enduring mystery, we must follow the thread of events that transformed him from loyal brother and protector of the realm into a crowned king presiding over one of the darkest episodes in English history. The timeline itself reads like an indictment, each date building upon the last in a carefully orchestrated seizure of power that left 2 innocent children trapped in the ancient fortress that would become their tomb. When Edward IV died suddenly on April 9, 1483, he left behind a kingdom in precarious balance. His eldest son, 12-year-old Edward, was the undisputed heir to the throne, a boy on the cusp of becoming a man, educated in the ways of kingship at Ludlow Castle, far from the intrigue of London. The younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, was only 9 years old, still in that stage of childhood where the world seems full of promise and adventure. Neither boy could have imagined that their father's death had set in motion a series of events that would end their lives before either reached manhood. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been Edward IV's most trusted ally, a warrior who had fought beside his brother through years of civil war, a man rewarded with vast estates in the north of England, where he ruled with a firm but reportedly fair hand. Contemporary accounts before his seizure of the throne suggest a man of capability and loyalty, someone the late king trusted implicitly. Edward IV's will named Richard as Lord Protector, the regent who would guide the young Edward V until the boy came of age. It seemed a natural choice, the uncle protecting his nephew's interests until the prince could rule in his own right. But what happened next reveals either a man forced by circumstance to take desperate measures or a calculating usurper who saw opportunity in his brother's death. The interpretation depends entirely on which sources you believe, and that is where the difficulty begins. Richard moved swiftly after his brother's death. While the young Edward V traveled from Ludlow toward London for his coronation, Richard intercepted the royal party at Stony Stratford on April 30th. He arrested the boy's maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, along with the prince's half-brother, Richard Grey. The charges were vague: accusations of plotting against the Lord Protector, plans to diminish Richard's rightful role in governing the realm. Within days, both men would be executed without trial, their heads separated from their bodies in the courtyard of Pontefract Castle. The young king protested, reportedly weeping at the seizure of his beloved uncle, but he was now entirely in Richard's custody. Edward V entered London on May 4, 1483, not in the triumphant procession expected of a new monarch, but as a boy increasingly isolated from everyone he had known and trusted. Richard's first action was to house the young king in the Tower of London. This, in itself, was not unusual. The Tower served many purposes in medieval England, including the traditional lodging place for monarchs before their coronation. Kings had stayed there before their crowning ceremonies for generations. Edward V took up residence in the royal apartments, and for a time, preparations for his coronation continued as though nothing were amiss. The date was set for June 22nd. Invitations went out across the kingdom. The machinery of a royal coronation ground forward with all its elaborate ceremony and symbolism. And then Richard changed everything. On June 16, 1483, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes, was brought from sanctuary at Westminster Abbey to join his brother in the Tower. Their mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, had fled to the Abbey's protection immediately after Edward IV's death, taking her younger children with her. She understood the danger her family faced in a kingdom where power was suddenly up for grabs. For weeks she had resisted all pressure to release her younger son, but finally she relented, persuaded by assurances that the boy was needed only to attend his brother's coronation, that he would be safe, that family should be together at such a momentous occasion. We can only imagine the reunion of the two brothers in the Tower that day. Did the younger boy run to embrace his elder brother, chattering about his adventure, unaware of the nets closing around them? Did Edward V feel relief at having family near again? Or did he sense with the prescience that sometimes comes to those in mortal danger that this reunion marked the beginning of the end? Just days later, on June 22nd, the date that should have marked Edward V's coronation, Richard instead made a stunning proclamation. He declared that his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid from the start, tainted by a prior contract of marriage Edward IV had allegedly made to another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. This claim, conveniently announced after all the principals were dead and unable to confirm or deny it, meant that every child of Edward and Elizabeth's union was illegitimate. At a stroke of legal sophistry, Richard had declared his nephews bastards with no claim to the throne. An assembly of lords and commons, later called the Titulus Regis, agreed to Richard's claim. Whether they did so out of genuine belief, political calculation, or simple fear is impossible to determine from this distance. What is certain is that on July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III in Westminster Abbey. The boys in the Tower, now declared illegitimate and stripped of their titles, ceased to be political heirs and became instead potential rallying points for rebellion, living reminders that Richard's claim to the throne rested on dubious legal ground. This is where the testimony grows darker and more fragmentary. In the weeks following Richard's coronation, there are reports of the two boys being seen in the Tower, often playing in the gardens, sometimes visible at windows. But with each passing day, these sightings became less frequent. By late summer of 1483, witnesses reported seeing the boys only occasionally, and always deeper within the Tower, withdrawn from the windows, no longer playing in the open spaces where curious Londoners could glimpse them. By autumn, they were not seen at all. The Italian diplomat, Dominic Mancini, who was in London during this period and left England in mid-July, recorded chilling observations. He wrote that the young king, Edward V, was seen less and less frequently, and when he did appear, witnesses said his face showed deep melancholy, as though he suspected the fate that awaited him. Mancini reported that the boy's physician, the last of their servants allowed to attend them, said the young king sought remission of his sins daily through confession, convinced he was facing death. These accounts, recorded by a foreign observer with no obvious stake in English politics, carry a weight that is difficult to dismiss. Other evidence comes from the Tudor period, written by men loyal to the dynasty that overthrew Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Thomas More's history, written in the early 1500s, provides the most detailed account of the murder. According to More, Richard ordered Sir James Tyrrell to kill the boys, and Tyrrell arranged for two men to smother them in their beds as they slept. More's account is vivid and horrifying, describing how the assassins buried the bodies at the foot of a staircase within the tower, covering them quickly in the night. But More was writing decades after the events, relying on sources he did not fully reveal, and he was writing in service of the Tudor dynasty, which had every reason to portray Richard as a monster. Then came the discovery that seemed to confirm the darkest suspicions. In 1674, workmen making repairs to a stone staircase in the Tower of London, specifically at the White Tower's external staircase, made a grim find. Buried approximately 10 feet beneath the stairs, they uncovered a wooden chest containing the skeletons of two children. The bones suggested ages consistent with the princes at the time of their disappearance. King Charles II, convinced these were the remains of the murdered princes, ordered them placed in an urn designed by Christopher Wren and interred in Westminster Abbey, in the chapel where so many monarchs lie. In 1933, the bones were briefly examined by medical experts. Their findings suggested the remains were indeed of two children, with ages approximately matching those of the princes in 1483. However, the examination was limited by the technology of the time and by restrictions on how thoroughly the bones could be studied. Modern requests to conduct DNA testing have been denied, leaving us with tantalizing but incomplete scientific evidence. The bones discovered beneath that staircase seem to point directly at Richard. The location matches Thomas More's account. The ages fit the princes. The timing of their burial, presumably shortly after Richard's coronation, when the boys disappeared from view, aligns with the political calculus that made their deaths advantageous to the new king. Every piece of circumstantial evidence forms a chain around Richard's neck, and yet Richard has his defenders, and their arguments deserve consideration. They point out that much of what we know about Richard III comes from Tudor sources, written by chroniclers serving the dynasty that won the throne by conquest. The Tudors needed Richard to be a villain to justify their own seizure of power. A rightful king, wrongfully deposed, makes for uncomfortable history. A child-murdering monster overthrown by a righteous warrior creates the founding myth a new dynasty requires. Richard's defenders note that he showed no history of cruelty or murder before his seizure of the throne. He governed the North effectively, and, by many accounts, justly. He introduced progressive legal reforms during his brief reign. Would such a man kill children? Some argue that the boys may have died of natural causes, plague, or illness claiming them as it claimed so many in that era. Others suggest that the boys may have been killed not by Richard's orders, but by overzealous supporters who believed they were acting in their king's interest. Still others propose that the boys may have survived Richard's reign, spirited away to live in obscurity, or even emerging years later as pretenders to the throne. The debate over Richard III's guilt has raged for more than 500 years, and it shows no signs of resolution. What we are left with is a man who had motive, means, and opportunity. We have a timeline that shows him systematically removing all obstacles between himself and the crown. We have the disappearance of two boys who stood in his way. We have bones that may or may not be theirs, buried in the very location where Tudor historians claimed they were hidden. Whether Richard was a calculating murderer or a man maligned by history, the princes in the tower remain vanished. Their fate a mystery that transforms a medieval power struggle into an eternal question about human nature and the corrupting influence of ambition. The tower keeps its secret still, those ancient stones silent about what they witnessed in the summer of 1483. History has a curious habit of writing its villains in bold strokes, while allowing its victors to slip into the shadows. For over 5 centuries, Richard III has worn the crown of infamy in the mystery of the princes in the Tower. Yet, there exists another suspect, one whose motives ran deeper and whose opportunities extended further than traditional narratives acknowledge. Henry Tudor, the man who would become Henry VII, stands at the center of a disturbing alternative theory, one that transforms our understanding of this most enduring royal mystery. On the 22nd of August, 1485, the course of English history changed forever on a muddy field in Leicestershire. The Battle of Bosworth Field lasted barely 2 hours, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. Henry Tudor, a relatively unknown Welsh nobleman with a tenuous claim to the English throne, defeated King Richard III in combat. Richard died that day, the last English king to fall in battle, and the crown that rolled from his broken skull into a hawthorn bush was placed upon Henry's head. The Tudor dynasty was born in blood and ambition on that summer afternoon. But Henry's victory, decisive as it was on the battlefield, created immediate and profound problems of legitimacy. His claim to the throne was remarkably weak, so fragile that it required mental gymnastics to justify. Through his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry descended from John of Gaunt. But this line came through an illegitimate branch that had been explicitly barred from royal succession. His father's Welsh heritage added nothing to his claim. In the complex hierarchy of 15th century English nobility, there were quite literally dozens of individuals with superior hereditary rights to wear the crown. Henry understood this vulnerability with crystal clarity. He needed to legitimize his rule through any means available, and the most obvious path was marriage. Within months of Bosworth Field, he married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, and the sister of the missing princes. This union was politically brilliant, joining the houses of Lancaster and Tudor with the House of York, theoretically ending the Wars of the Roses that had torn England apart for 3 decades. The white rose and the red rose combined to create the Tudor rose, a symbol that still endures today. Yet this marriage, this cornerstone of Henry's legitimacy strategy, contained within it a devastating paradox. For Elizabeth of York to transfer any legitimacy to Henry through their union, she needed to be legitimate herself. But Richard III had declared Edward IV's children illegitimate through the act known as titulus regius. This declaration, which stated that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid due to a prior betrothal, was the legal foundation that had allowed Richard to take the throne in the first place. If Elizabeth of York was illegitimate, then her marriage to Henry meant nothing for his claim. Henry needed her legitimate to boost his own credentials. So Henry took the extraordinary step of repealing Titulus Regius shortly after taking power. He went further, ordering all copies of the document destroyed, making it a crime to even possess the text. This action restored Elizabeth of York's legitimacy, which served Henry's purposes, but it created another problem entirely, one that should have kept him awake through long winter nights at Westminster Palace. If Elizabeth and her siblings were legitimate, then what of her brothers? What of the princes in the Tower? Edward V, the elder prince, had been 12 years old when he disappeared. Richard, Duke of York, had been 9. Under the laws of primogeniture that governed English succession, if these boys were alive and legitimate, they had far superior claims to the throne than Henry Tudor ever could. Edward V was the rightful king. His younger brother Richard stood next in line. Only after both boys would come their sisters, including Elizabeth of York. Henry Tudor, by any measure of hereditary right, stood nowhere in this sequence. This presents us with a chilling question that historians have danced around for centuries. What value would Henry Tudor place on the lives of 2 boys who stood between him and the security of his throne? What might a man capable of invading his own country and claiming its crown through force of arms be willing to do to eliminate rival claimants? Here the mystery deepens into genuinely disturbing territory. If Richard III had murdered the princes during his 2-year reign, as tradition insists, then Henry possessed a propaganda weapon of extraordinary power. Imagine the political advantage of producing two murdered children and laying them at the feet of the previous regime. Henry could have paraded the bodies of the princes through London, given them a state funeral, allowed the nation to mourn, and cemented Richard's reputation as a child murderer for all time. Such a revelation would have transformed Henry from usurper to liberator, the man who avenged innocent blood and restored righteous rule to England. Yet Henry did nothing of the sort. He never produced the princes, alive or dead. He never displayed their bodies. He never even officially accused Richard of their murder during his lifetime. For a man whose reign was plagued by challenges to his legitimacy, for a king who executed pretenders and potential rivals with ruthless efficiency, this silence is definite. The question echoes across the centuries. Why would Henry Tudor, who had everything to gain from proving Richard's guilt, never offer a shred of evidence that the princes died during Richard's reign? The most unsettling answer is that Henry could not prove what had not yet occurred. If the princes were still alive when Richard fell at Bosworth Field, then Henry inherited a problem far more dangerous than a predecessor's crime. He inherited living, breathing rival claimants whose very existence threatened everything he had fought to achieve. Under this theory, the princes survived Richard's 2-year reign, perhaps imprisoned but alive, only to face a new captor with far more compelling reasons to ensure their permanent silence. Consider the timeline with fresh eyes. Richard became king in June of 1483. The princes were last seen in public during the late summer of that year. Richard's reign lasted until August of 1485-50. During those 2 years, despite being labeled a usurper and a tyrant by his enemies, despite having numerous opponents who would have seized upon any evidence of murdered children, no contemporary source definitively stated that the princes were dead. The rumors swirled, certainly. Whispers and suspicions circulated through the courts of Europe. But concrete evidence? Bodies? Confessions? None emerged during Richard's lifetime. Henry took power in 1485 and would rule until 1509, a reign of nearly 24 years. During this time, he faced repeated challenges from pretenders claiming to be one of the missing princes. These challenges terrified him in ways that seem excessive if he knew with certainty that both boys were dead. His reactions speak to genuine fear, not the irritation of a king bothered by obvious impostors. The case of Perkin Warbeck stands as the most compelling and suspicious of these pretender episodes. Warbeck appeared in 1491, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes. He didn't simply make wild claims from a tavern somewhere. Warbeck was recognized and supported by significant European royalty. The Duchess of Burgundy, Margaret of York, who was the aunt of the real princes, and would presumably have known her own nephew, publicly acknowledged Warbeck as her kinsman. The King of France received him. The King of Scotland not only believed his claim, but gave him a royal bride, Lady Catherine Gordon. These were not fools or simpletons easily deceived by any charlatan with a convenient story. These were sophisticated political operators with access to information and intelligence networks spanning Europe. Their acceptance of Warbeck suggests he presented a remarkably convincing case, possessed knowledge or characteristics that aligned with what the younger prince would have known or displayed. The question that haunts this episode is simple. What did Warbeck know, and how did he know it? Henry's response to Warbeck reveals the depths of his paranoia and fear. He didn't dismiss this pretender with royal disdain or amused contempt. Instead, Henry pursued Warbeck with obsessive intensity for years, spending vast sums of money to discredit him, employing spies across Europe to track his movements, pressuring foreign courts to withdraw their support. When Warbeck finally fell into his hands in 1497, Henry extracted a confession, paraded him through London, and kept him imprisoned in the Tower of London. Then, in 1599, Henry executed him along with Edward, Earl of Warwick, another potential Yorkist claimant, who had the misfortune of having royal blood. The execution of Warwick is particularly revealing. This young man had been imprisoned since childhood, locked away because of who he was, not what he had done. He was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, and thus a nephew of both Edward IV and Richard III. His claim to the throne was arguably stronger than Henry's. Henry kept him imprisoned for over a decade before finally deciding that his mere existence was too dangerous to tolerate. Warwick was executed in 1599, beheaded on Tower Hill for the crime of his bloodline. If Henry could murder a simple-minded young man who had spent most of his life in captivity and posed no active threat, what would he have done to two legitimate princes who represented far greater dangers to his crown? The pattern becomes clear when examining Henry's reign as a whole. He was a man haunted by the fragility of his claim, who saw threats in shadows and eliminated rivals with cold calculation. He hoarded money obsessively, building a treasury that made him the wealthiest king England had ever seen, because wealth meant the ability to pay armies and suppress rebellions. He created an atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance, employing informers and spies to root out potential conspiracies. His reign, despite bringing an end to the Wars of the Roses, was marked by a paranoid authoritarianism born of deep insecurity. This psychological profile matters when we consider the fate of the princes. Richard III, whatever his other faults, was a secure king before Bosworth Field. He had defeated rebellions, controlled his realm, and showed no signs of being overthrown before Henry's invasion. His motivation to murder his nephews existed, but was not urgent by the summer of 1485. Henry Tudor, by contrast, sat upon a throne he had seized by force, surrounded by people with better hereditary claims, married to a woman whose brothers stood between him and legitimate rule. Every day those princes remained alive was a day his crown sat uneasily upon his head. Some historians argue that if the princes had been alive when Henry took power, Richard would have produced them to embarrass his opponent, or Henry's enemies would have used them as figureheads for a rebellion. But this logic fails to account for the complexity of the situation. If the princes were imprisoned in the Tower when Richard fell at Bosworth, they would have simply transferred to Henry's custody along with the castle and all its prisoners. Henry would have had complete control over them before anyone else even knew they existed or had survived. The Tower of London in 1485 was not just a palace but a fortress and a prison, a place where inconvenient people could disappear with terrible ease. The princes, if alive, would have been there already, hidden away in rooms where only trusted servants could reach them. For Henry to ensure their silence would have required nothing dramatic, no public spectacle. A pillow in the night, perhaps. Poison in their food. A quiet disposal of small bodies that no one outside a handful of conspirators would ever have to know about. There is a grim irony in the fact that the traditional narrative places the princes' deaths in the very building that Henry subsequently used as his primary prison for dangerous rivals. The Tower would become synonymous with Tudor ruthlessness, the place where Henry VIII would later send two of his wives to their deaths, where Lady Jane Grey would lose her head, where so much royal blood would soak into ancient stone. The Tudor relationship with the Tower of London began with Henry VII, and if the alternative theory holds weight, it began with child murder, disguised as historical necessity. The absence of bodies remains the greatest mystery in this case. In 1474, during renovations at the Tower of London, workers discovered a wooden box containing the skeletons of two children buried beneath the staircase. These remains were assumed to be the princes and were reburied in Westminster Abbey by order of King Charles II. Modern forensic analysis has been limited and inconclusive, unable to definitively establish the age, identity, or even the era of these bones. They might be the princes. They might be other children entirely, victims of London's disease-ridden medieval centuries. We simply do not know. What we do know is that Henry Tudor had both motive and opportunity to eliminate the princes, and his behavior following Bosworth Field suggests a man with something to hide. His refusal to produce evidence of Richard's guilt, his savage responses to pretenders, his execution of rival claimants, his nervous hoarding of wealth and power all paint a portrait of a king, terrified that his throne might be pulled from beneath him at any moment. This was not the confidence of a man who had defeated a child murderer and restored justice to England. This was the anxiety of a usurper who knew his claim was built on sand and blood. The truth may be that history has punished the wrong king. Richard III, hunchbacked in reputation if not in body, has carried the weight of this crime for 500 years. But the evidence, examined coldly and without the bias of Tudor propaganda, points equally, if not more convincingly, toward Henry VII. The princes may indeed have died in the Tower of London, but perhaps they died not under Richard's crown but under Henry's. Not in 1483, but sometime after 1485. Victims not of a usurping uncle, but of a calculating conqueror who could not afford to let them live. In the autumn air of 1483, a man stood poised at the pinnacle of power, second only to the king himself. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, had achieved in mere months what most nobles spent lifetimes pursuing. His voice carried weight in council chambers, his signature appeared on the most important documents of the realm, and his armies answered to his command. Yet within weeks, this same man would be kneeling in a marketplace square in Salisbury, his neck bared to the executioner's blade, his meteoric rise extinguished as suddenly as it had begun. The question that haunts historians to this day is not merely why Buckingham fell, but what terrible secret he might have taken to his grave. Henry Stafford was no ordinary nobleman seeking advancement through service to the crown. Royal blood coursed through his veins, traced back through his descent from Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest son of King Edward III. This lineage placed him disturbingly close to the throne itself, closer than many realized or cared to acknowledge. By the complex mathematics of medieval succession, should the right circumstances arise and the right obstacles be removed, Buckingham himself might press a claim to wear the crown of England. It was a dangerous heritage to possess in those uncertain times when the succession itself remained contested and every man of noble birth calculated his position in the great hierarchy of power. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in April of 1483, Buckingham had been residing in relative obscurity, wealthy and titled, but far from the center of power. The Woodville family, relatives of the late king's wife Elizabeth, had monopolized influence during Edward's reign, and men like Buckingham had been kept at arm's length. But the death of a king reshuffles all the cards, and Buckingham proved himself a masterful player in the deadly game that followed. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, needed allies as he moved to secure his position as Lord Protector for his young nephew, the 12-year-old Edward V. The Woodvilles represented a threat, a powerful faction determined to maintain their influence through control of the boy king. Buckingham recognized opportunity when he saw it. He rode to Richard's side with uncommon haste, pledging not just support but fervent devotion to Richard's cause. Together, they intercepted the young king's party as it traveled from Wales to London, arresting the boy's Woodville guardians and effectively ending that family's brief supremacy. For this service, Buckingham was rewarded beyond the dreams of most men. Richard showered offices and honors upon his newfound ally with remarkable generosity. Buckingham became Lord High Constable of England, one of the realm's most powerful positions. He was granted the supervision of royal castles throughout Wales and the Western Marches. Lands and revenues flowed to him in staggering quantities. When Richard took the throne himself in late June of 1483, declaring his brother's children illegitimate through a questionable claim about a prior marriage contract, Buckingham stood prominently at his side during the coronation, carrying out the most visible and honored ceremonial duties. To observers at the time, the two men appeared inseparable, bound by mutual interest and genuine friendship. Richard trusted Buckingham as he trusted few others. The Duke appeared to reciprocate that trust with absolute loyalty. They were seen together constantly, consulting on matters of state, making decisions that would shape the kingdom's future. Buckingham's rise seemed not just rapid, but unstoppable. He had become, in effect, the second most powerful man in England, and all this achieved in barely 3 months. Then the princes disappeared from public view. Young Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, had been residing in the Tower of London, as was customary for royalty awaiting coronation. Through the summer of 1483, they were seen less and less frequently, playing in the Tower gardens or appearing at windows. By autumn, sightings ceased entirely. Rumors began to circulate through London's streets and taverns. The princes were dead, people whispered. They had been murdered. But who had killed them, and on whose orders? This is where Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, enters the darkest chapter of his story, and one of history's most enduring mysteries. Several contemporary and near-contemporary sources pointed fingers not at Richard, but at Buckingham himself. The logic of such accusations carried a terrible plausibility. Buckingham had access to the Tower, had Richard's trust, and had the organizational capacity to arrange such a crime. More importantly, he had motive, multiple motives in fact, depending on which theory one examines. The first possibility is the most straightforward, but also the most chilling. Perhaps Buckingham murdered the princes specifically to please Richard, to remove the most obvious threat to the new king's reign, without Richard having to issue such an unspeakable order himself. In this reading, Buckingham acted as the perfect courtier, anticipating his master's unspoken wishes and fulfilling them with ruthless efficiency. Medieval courts were full of ambitious men who understood that the path to continued favor sometimes required getting blood on one's hands while keeping the king's hands clean. Buckingham might have calculated that such a service would bind Richard to him forever, making him indispensable, perhaps even positioning him as heir should Richard's own son die. But there exists a second, more sinister possibility that transforms Buckingham from loyal servant into calculating murderer with designs of his own. What if Buckingham killed the princes not to help Richard, but to destroy him? By murdering the boys and ensuring suspicion fell upon the king, Buckingham could undermine Richard's legitimacy and popular support while simultaneously removing two obstacles that stood between his own royal bloodline and the throne. It was a scheme of breathtaking audacity and cold-blooded cunning, requiring Buckingham to play the role of faithful ally while plotting his master's downfall and his own elevation. This theory gains considerable weight when examined alongside what happened next. In October of 1483, barely 4 months after Richard's coronation and mere weeks after the princes vanished, Buckingham did something that shocked the entire realm. He rebelled against King Richard. The suddenness of this betrayal seemed inexplicable to contemporaries. Here was a man who had been elevated beyond measure, who had stood at Richard's side through every critical moment, who appeared to have everything to gain from continued loyalty. Yet he raised his standard in revolt, gathering forces and coordinating with other dissidents, including supporters of the exiled Henry Tudor. The official explanations for Buckingham's rebellion have never fully satisfied historians. Some sources claimed he was influenced by John Morton, Bishop of Ely, a wily political operative who was in Buckingham's custody at the time. Morton supposedly worked upon Buckingham's ambitions and conscience, turning him against Richard. Other accounts suggested Buckingham had been promised rewards by the rebellion's organizers that exceeded even what Richard had given him. Still others hinted at a falling out between the two men, perhaps over Buckingham's failure to receive some promised grant or office. But what if the rebellion was always part of Buckingham's plan? What if he had murdered the princes specifically to create the conditions for Richard's downfall, intending all along to turn against the king once the deed was done and the boys were safely dead? In this scenario, Buckingham's betrayal makes perfect sense. He had removed the princes who might challenge his own claim. He had ensured Richard would be blamed for their deaths, poisoning public opinion against the king. Now he moved to remove Richard himself, clearing the final obstacle to his own coronation. The rebellion failed catastrophically. Buckingham's forces never properly assembled, hampered by terrible weather and poor coordination. The expected uprising in the southeast fizzled. Support for the rebellion collapsed before it truly began. Buckingham found himself abandoned and hunted, fleeing through the Welsh countryside with Richard's forces closing in. He was betrayed by a retainer, captured, and brought to Salisbury, where Richard had established his headquarters. What happened next has fueled centuries of speculation. Richard refused to see Buckingham. The former friend and ally, the man who had stood beside him during his rise to power, was not granted an audience with the king. No private conversation occurred. No opportunity for explanation or plea for mercy was allowed. Instead, Richard ordered Buckingham's immediate execution. On November 2nd, 1483, All Souls' Day, Henry Stafford was beheaded in the marketplace at Salisbury. The speed of this execution is remarkable and deeply suspicious. Buckingham was not just any rebel. He was one of the realm's premier nobles, a man of royal descent, and someone who until weeks earlier had been Richard's closest advisor. Yet he was given no trial, no chance to speak in his own defense, no opportunity to reveal whatever he might know about recent events. He was simply killed, quickly and quietly, or as quietly as a public execution can be. This haste has led many to wonder what Richard feared Buckingham might say. If Buckingham had murdered the princes on his own initiative, without Richard's knowledge or approval, he might have revealed this during a trial, attempting to save his own life by exposing the truth. Such testimony would exonerate Richard of the murders, but would also reveal the king's vulnerability, showing how easily a supposed ally could commit such a crime while enjoying the king's trust. Alternatively, If Buckingham and Richard had conspired together to murder the princes, Buckingham, facing death, might have decided to take Richard down with him, revealing the king's complicity in the crime. Either way, Richard had every reason to ensure Buckingham never spoke publicly about the prince's fate. A swift execution solved that problem permanently. Whatever Buckingham knew died with him in Salisbury marketplace. The secret, if there was one, remained buried. The evidence surrounding Buckingham's potential guilt is circumstantial but compelling. He had access to the Tower and to the princes. He had the administrative capability and the ruthlessness to arrange their murders. He had motive, whether to please Richard or to advance his own claim. His sudden rebellion makes more sense if he had already committed an irreversible crime that would eventually come to light. And his hasty execution suggests someone wanted him silenced before he could tell what he knew. Yet Buckingham remains one of history's overlooked suspects in the prince's murder. Most popular accounts focus entirely on Richard as the obvious culprit. Buckingham appears, if at all, as merely Richard's accomplice or tool. But the Duke deserves consideration as a primary suspect in his own right, a man whose ambitions and bloodline gave him every reason to clear his own path to the throne, regardless of Richard's wishes. The mystery of Henry Stafford endures because the pieces fit together too neatly from multiple angles. Every theory about his involvement has logic to support it, yet none can be proven definitively. He remains a shadow figure in a shadowy crime, a man who rose impossibly high and fell impossibly fast, leaving historians to wonder whether he was loyal servant, independent murderer, or calculating traitor who almost seized a crown. In the summer of 1483, a mother made a choice that would echo through the centuries, a decision so desperate and so secretive that historians still debate whether it was an act of brilliant salvation or tragic abandonment. Elizabeth Woodville, Queen of England, widow of Edward IV, stood at a crossroads where every path led through darkness, and the theory that emerged from the shadows of her actions suggests something almost unthinkable. What if she, the mother of the princes in the Tower, orchestrated their very disappearance to save their lives? The traditional narrative tells us that Richard III murdered his nephews, the young Edward V and Richard of York, sometime during the summer or autumn of 1483. But this version of events requires us to believe that Elizabeth Woodville, a woman known for her fierce protection of her children and her political cunning, simply accepted their deaths without protest, without evidence, without revenge. The alternative theory paints a very different picture, one of maternal desperation meeting royal intrigue, of a mother forced to choose between seeing her sons dead and never seeing them alive again. Consider the sequence of events as they actually unfolded. When Edward IV died suddenly in April of 1483, his eldest son became Edward V at just 12 years old. Elizabeth knew immediately that her family was vulnerable. Her husband's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved swiftly to intercept the young king as he traveled from Ludlow to London for his coronation. Richard arrested Elizabeth's brother Anthony Woodville and her son from her first marriage, Richard Grey, executing them shortly after. The message was unmistakable. The Woodville influence was being systematically eliminated. Elizabeth's response was immediate and telling. She fled to Westminster Abbey, claiming sanctuary with her younger son, Richard of York, her 5 daughters, and whatever portable wealth she could gather. This was not the first time she had sought sanctuary there. During the Wars of the Roses, she had given birth to Edward V himself within those protective walls while her husband fought for his throne. She knew the Abbey's power, knew that its ancient right of sanctuary had protected fugitives and nobles alike for centuries. But here the theory takes its first intriguing turn. Why did she take only her younger son into sanctuary? Why not attempt to reclaim her eldest boy, the king himself, from his uncle's custody? Some historians argue she had no choice, that 12-year-old Edward was already beyond her reach, surrounded by Richard's men and moving toward London under guard. But Elizabeth Woodville was not a woman who accepted powerlessness easily. She had risen from minor nobility to become Queen of England through a combination of beauty, intelligence, and ruthless determination. She had navigated the treacherous politics of the Wars of the Roses, survived the temporary overthrow of her husband, and emerged stronger each time. The idea that she simply surrendered her eldest son without a fight seems inconsistent with everything we know about her character. What if her flight to sanctuary was not an act of desperation, but the first move in a carefully planned strategy? Within the abbey's walls, surrounded by priests and the ancient rites of the church, Elizabeth had time to think, to plan, to use the extensive network of connections she had built during her years as queen. She had allies among the merchant classes, ties to foreign courts, and the loyalty of those who had benefited from Woodville patronage over the years. She also had something Richard desperately needed for his own plans: her younger son, the Duke of York. The historical record shows that Richard negotiated extensively with Elizabeth to persuade her to release young Richard from sanctuary. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself, Cardinal Bourchier, came to Westminster Abbey to convince her. According to contemporary accounts, Elizabeth was deeply reluctant, weeping and protesting, arguing that her son was too young, that sanctuary should protect him. And yet, after days of negotiation, she agreed. She allowed her 9-year-old son to leave the safety of the abbey and join his brother in the Tower of London. On the surface, this seems like defeat, like a mother forced to surrender her child to almost certain doom. But what if those negotiations involved more than we know? What if Elizabeth extracted promises, made arrangements, secured guarantees that history did not record? The Tower of London, we must remember, was not yet the sinister prison of popular imagination. It was a royal residence where kings traditionally stayed before their coronations. When Elizabeth's son joined his brother there in mid-June of 1483, it would not have seemed like a death sentence to observers. But Elizabeth knew what was coming. Richard's path to the throne required more than just custody of his nephews. It required their complete removal from the succession. On June the 22nd, 1483, just days after young Richard joined his brother in the Tower, a clergyman named Ralph Shaw preached a sermon at St. Paul's Cross, declaring that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid, that all their children were bastards, that Richard of Gloucester was the rightful king. The legal justification was based on a claim that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry another woman before his secret wedding to Elizabeth, making that marriage bigamous and void. For Elizabeth, this moment must have crystallized everything. Her sons were now officially illegitimate, barred from the throne, but still dangerous to Richard simply by existing. 2 living boys with royal blood, whom many would still consider the rightful heirs regardless of parliamentary declarations, represented a permanent threat to Richard's reign. The calculus was brutally simple. If the boys remained in Richard's custody, visible and accessible, they would either be used as figureheads for rebellion or eliminated as threats. Here the theory suggests Elizabeth made her impossible choice. Better to have her sons disappear into obscurity, alive but unknown, than to have them murdered in their beds. And she had the means to accomplish this. As former queen, she still had connections within the Tower. Servants who had served her household, guards who owed their positions to Woodville patronage, officials who could be bribed or persuaded. The Tower in 1483 was not the impregnable fortress of later centuries. People moved in and out with relative freedom. Supplies were delivered daily. The royal apartments had access to the river. The plan would have required extraordinary coordination and absolute secrecy. Substitutes would need to be found, boys of approximately the right age and appearance who could be seen in the Tower windows, maintaining the illusion that the princes remained in residence. The real princes would need to be smuggled out, perhaps hidden in laundry carts or supply barges, moved under cover of darkness to safe houses Elizabeth had prepared. From there, they could be sent abroad, perhaps to Burgundy where Elizabeth's sister Margaret was Dowager Duchess, or to other sympathetic courts in Europe. This would explain one of the great mysteries of the case: the complete absence of bodies. Despite extensive searches over the centuries, despite the discovery of bones in 1674 that may or may not have been the princes, no definitive remains have ever been conclusively identified. If the boys were murdered in the Tower and their bodies hidden, surely some trace would have emerged in 500 years. But if they were never killed at all, if they were spirited away to new lives under new names, then the absence of bodies makes perfect sense. The theory gains intriguing support from Elizabeth's subsequent actions. After Richard III took the throne in July of 1483, Elizabeth remained in sanctuary for months, but her behavior grew increasingly peculiar. She began to negotiate with Richard, to discuss terms for leaving sanctuary. By March of 1484, she agreed to a reconciliation. She left Westminster Abbey, and even more shockingly, she allowed her daughters, the princesses who were Richard's nieces, to return to court. Richard made a public oath that he would protect them and arrange good marriages for them. Why would a mother reconcile with the man she believed had murdered her sons? This question has troubled historians for centuries. The traditional explanation is that Elizabeth had no choice, that she was powerless and made the best of a terrible situation. But this explanation requires us to believe that Elizabeth, who had shown such fierce determination throughout her life, simply gave up and collaborated with her children's killer. The alternative is that she knew her sons were alive, that she had negotiated their safety in exchange for her public acceptance of Richard's reign, and that her reconciliation was part of a larger bargain to protect what remained of her family. But the theory faces its greatest challenge in what happened next. When Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian claimant, invaded England in 1485, Elizabeth's support proved crucial to his cause. Her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, was betrothed to Henry, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York. When Richard III died at Bosworthfield in August of 1485, Henry became king and married Elizabeth's daughter in January of 1486. Elizabeth Woodville became the king's mother-in-law, a position of considerable influence. And yet she never demanded proof that her sons were dead. She never insisted that Henry investigate their fate. She never pushed for their restoration if they lived or revenge if they had been murdered. Instead, she supported the Tudor claim absolutely, even though it depended on her sons being either dead or permanently disappeared. If her sons had been killed by Richard, one would expect her to demand justice, to insist on evidence, to use her new position to uncover the truth. If she knew they were alive and hiding, her silence makes much more sense. She had saved them by making them vanish, and any investigation, any search for truth, would only endanger them again. In 1487, Elizabeth Woodville was stripped of her lands and forced into retirement at Bermondsey Abbey. The official reason was that she had made peace with Richard III, but this explanation seems thin. Many nobles had accepted Richard's reign and were not punished for it. Some historians suggest that Elizabeth knew too much, that she possessed dangerous secrets that Henry Tudor could not risk having revealed. What if those secrets concerned the fate of the princes? What if Henry discovered, or suspected, that the boys had not been murdered at all, that they lived somewhere beyond England's borders, potential claimants who could destabilize his new dynasty? The theory requires us to imagine Elizabeth's final years, living in quiet retirement, knowing that her sons lived but could never acknowledge her, could never return to England, could never claim their birthright. She died in 1492, her will requesting a modest funeral, a woman who had been queen now buried without ceremony. Did she die knowing she had saved her children's lives? Did she receive secret messages from them over the years, coded letters describing their new lives in foreign lands? Or did she die wondering if she had made the right choice, if exile and anonymity were truly better than the risk of fighting for the throne? The unbearable calculus of a mother choosing exile for her children over their murders haunts this theory. Elizabeth would have had to accept never seeing her sons again, never holding them, never hearing their voices. She would have had to watch them be declared dead, allow monuments and prayers for their souls, maintain the fiction of their murder while knowing they live. She would have had to see her daughter marry Henry Tudor and produce heirs, creating a new royal line while her sons, the rightful kings, lived in obscurity somewhere across the sea. No definitive proof exists for this theory. No letters have been found describing the plan. No deathbed confessions emerged. The princes, if they survived, left no trace in historical records, or at least none that we have identified. And yet the theory persists because it answers questions that the traditional narrative cannot fully address. It explains Elizabeth's reconciliation with Richard. It accounts for the absence of bodies. It makes sense of her silence during Henry's reign. Most of all, it offers a version of events where a mother's love, not an uncle's ambition, determined the prince's fate, where Elizabeth Woodville becomes not a helpless victim, but an active agent who sacrificed everything, including her own happiness and reputation, to save her children's lives in the only way available to her. Whether this theory reflects historical truth or wishful thinking It reminds us that the people in these ancient dramas were not just political pawns, but human beings facing impossible choices, and that sometimes the most powerful act of love is letting go, even when it breaks your heart. In the bitter winter of 1502, nearly 2 decades after the princes in the tower vanished from history, a man named Sir James Tyrrell stood in a cold cell awaiting execution. His crime was treason against King Henry VII, a charge unrelated to any royal murder. Yet before the axe would fall, Tyrrell would supposedly provide the Tudor king with something far more valuable than his life. He would confess to killing the 2 young princes who had disappeared so mysteriously from the Tower of London in 1483. The confession came at a remarkably convenient time for Henry Tudor. After almost 20 years of rule, whispers still circulated about the fate of Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York. Pretenders claiming to be the younger prince had challenged Henry's throne, most notably Perkin Warbeck, who had maintained for years that he was Richard of York, miraculously escaped from death. Though Warbeck had been executed in 1499, questions lingered. Henry needed closure to this persistent wound in his legitimacy. He needed someone to confess that the boys were definitely dead, killed not by Tudor hands but by the supposedly wicked Richard III. And there, condemned already, and with nothing left to lose, was James Tyrrell. According to the official Tudor account, Tyrrell confessed that King Richard III had sent him a warrant commanding the murder of the princes. The story went that Tyrrell traveled to the Tower of London and recruited 2 men to carry out the actual deed. Their names were given as Miles Forrest, one of the prince's attendants, and John Dighton, a groom of the royal household. Under cover of darkness, these 2 men entered the chamber where the young princes slept. They pressed the feather pillows and mattress over the faces of the boys, smothering them as they struggled for breath. When the children's bodies finally went still, Tyrrell was called to view the corpses. He ordered the bodies buried at the foot of a staircase within the tower, hastily and without ceremony, like refuse to be hidden away. It was a detailed and damning story, one that perfectly served Henry VII's purposes. It confirmed Richard III as a child murderer. It explained why no trace of the boys had been found. And it came from the mouth of a man who had been close to Richard during his reign. Tyrrell had indeed been one of Richard's trusted servants. He had been knighted after the Battle of Tewkesbury, and had served Richard loyally when he was Duke of Gloucester, and later as king. After Richard's death at Bosworth Field, Tyrrell had initially made peace with the Tudor regime, but eventually he had retreated to Calais, where he served as governor of the fortress there. But here is where the convenient confession begins to unravel under scrutiny. Tyrrell's arrest in 1502 had nothing whatsoever to do with the princes. He was charged with supporting the claims of Edmund de la Pole, another Yorkist pretender to the throne. Tyrrell was lured from Calais under false pretenses, arrested, and condemned to death. Only then, according to Tudor sources, did he suddenly decide to confess to a murder committed nearly 20 years earlier. The timing was extraordinary. For almost 2 decades, through the reigns of both Richard III and Henry VII, Tyrrell had apparently kept this monumental secret. He had watched as pretenders claimed to be the missing princes. He had seen Henry struggle to establish his dynasty's legitimacy. Yet, he had said nothing. Only when he was already facing execution for an entirely different crime did this confession supposedly emerge. The nature of the confession itself raises profound questions. Most significantly, the full text of Tyrrell's confession was never made public. This is remarkable considering how valuable such a document would have been to the Tudor propaganda machine. Henry VII was not shy about publicizing things that served his interests. He had paraded Perkin Warbeck through the streets. He had published proclamations and letters. Yet this confession, which supposedly solved the greatest mystery of the age and confirmed his predecessor as a monster, was never shown to the public in its complete form. We have only summaries written by Tudor chroniclers, each one potentially shaped by what the regime wanted people to believe. The chronicler Thomas More, writing decades later during the reign of Henry VIII, provided the most detailed account of the confession and the murders. But More was a child when the princes disappeared. His information came from sources within the Tudor court, sources that had every reason to portray Richard in the darkest possible light. More's account includes vivid details about the murder itself, the struggle of the innocent children, the remorse of the killers. These are the touches of a skilled writer and lawyer, not necessarily the marks of historical truth. Moore never claimed to have seen Tyrell's actual confession. He was reconstructing events based on stories told to him by people with clear political motivations. Even the witnesses Tyrell allegedly named present problems. Miles Forrest was said to have died in sanctuary soon after the murders, tormented by guilt. How convenient that he was dead, and could neither confirm nor deny the story. John Dighton supposedly survived and, according to some accounts, corroborated parts of the tale. Yet Dighton was never punished for his alleged role in murdering 2 princes of the blood. If the confession was genuine and Dighton admitted his part, why was he allowed to live free? The Tudor regime executed people for far lesser crimes. The supposed murderer of 2 royal children walking free makes no sense unless the confession itself was questionable. Consider also what Tyrell himself had to gain or lose. He was already condemned to death for treason. The sentence was final. Confessing to the murder of the princes would not save his life or improve his circumstances, but perhaps it could save someone else. Tyrell had a family, and in the brutal politics of Tudor England, families of traitors often suffered along with the condemned. Property was confiscated, heirs were attainted, bloodlines were stained. Is it possible that Tyrell was offered a deal? Confess to killing the princes under Richard's orders, and your family will be spared the worst consequences of your treason. It would explain why a loyal servant who had kept silent for so long would suddenly speak up only when he had nothing personally to gain. There is another troubling aspect to consider. If Tyrell genuinely killed the princes on Richard's orders in 1483, why did Richard continue to trust him so completely? After such a dark deed, one might expect Richard to eliminate the witness to his crime. Instead, Richard showered Tyrell with honors and positions of responsibility. He made him a knight banneret. He granted him lands and offices. He trusted him with military commands and diplomatic missions. This is strange behavior toward a man who knew Richard's darkest secret and could expose him at any moment. Unless, of course, Tyrell had committed no such crime, and Richard had no such fear. The physical evidence presents its own mysteries. In 1674, during renovations at the Tower of London, workers discovered a wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. Charles II ordered them examined, and then had them buried in Westminster Abbey as the lost princes. In 1933, the bones were briefly examined again, and experts suggested they could be consistent with boys of the right ages. But the examination was limited, and the conclusions uncertain. Modern requests to conduct DNA testing on the bones have been refused by the royal family. We cannot know for certain if these are even the princes' remains, let alone who killed them or when they died. What we are left with is a story that emerged at the perfect time for Henry VII, told by a man about to die who could gain nothing from it personally, never fully published or documented, and contradicted by various details that do not quite add up. It has all the hallmarks of a confession extracted under duress or offered under coercion, shaped to fit the political needs of the moment rather than the complex truth of history. James Tyrell went to his execution on the 6th of May, 1502. He was beheaded on Tower Hill for treason against the crown. Did he die knowing he had told the truth about the fate of 2 innocent boys? Or did he die having provided Henry Tudor with a convenient lie that would blacken Richard's name forever? The men employed to supposedly carry out the smothering Forrest and Dighton fade into historical shadows, one allegedly dead and one inexplicably unpunished. And Richard III, already defeated and dead for 17 years when the confession emerged, could not defend himself against the accusation. The confession of James Tyrell remains one of history's most debated documents, if it can even be called a document at all. It forms the primary basis for the belief that Richard III murdered his nephews, yet it appeared only when it was most useful to Richard's enemies and in circumstances that make its reliability deeply questionable. Whether Tyrell was a guilty man finally unburdening his conscience, or a condemned prisoner giving his captors the story they wanted in exchange for mercy toward his family, we may never know. What we do know is that truth extracted from a man facing the executioner's block. Truth that arrives conveniently after nearly 20 years of silence. Truth that serves the purposes of those in power so perfectly, deserves to be examined with the deepest skepticism. The smothering of 2 princes may have happened exactly as Tyrell supposedly described. or it may be one more layer of deception in a mystery that has consumed historians for more than 5 centuries. The workmen couldn't have known what they were about to uncover. It was 1674, more than a century and a half after the princes vanished, and laborers were demolishing an old wooden staircase in the Tower of London. The stones were being pulled away, the timber rotting from centuries of damp. Then, about 10 feet beneath the stairs leading to the chapel of the White Tower, their tools struck something solid. A wooden chest, ancient and partially decayed, buried exactly where it shouldn't be. Inside lay 2 small skeletons, bones intermingled, as though whoever placed them there had done so in haste, in darkness, in terrible secrecy. The location sent chills through everyone who heard the news. Sir Thomas More, writing decades after the princes disappeared, had described precisely this spot as the burial place. He claimed that the men who smothered the boys in their beds had first buried them at the stair foot, secretly, by night. The bodies were later moved, More wrote, but he never said where. Now here were 2 small skeletons, found exactly where the original burial was supposed to have occurred. The odds seemed impossibly, eerily precise. King Charles II ordered the bones brought to him. He examined them with his court physicians and advisors, and the conclusion seemed inescapable. These were the lost princes, Edward and Richard, murdered nearly 200 years before. Charles commanded that they be given a burial befitting their royal blood. In 1678, the small bones were placed in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren himself and laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, among the kings and queens of England. A Latin inscription identified them as the Innocents, the murdered sons of Edward IV. The case, it seemed, was finally closed. The princes had been found, but had they? In 1933, experts were permitted to examine the bones. What they discovered raised more questions than answers. The skeletons appeared to be those of children, certainly, but the ages were difficult to determine with precision. One might have been around 12 years old, roughly Edward's age. The other was harder to place. Some features suggested a younger child, perhaps 7 or 8, but Richard was 9 when he vanished, not 7. Other bones showed anomalies that didn't quite fit the historical record. Then came the most disturbing revelation of all. Mixed in with the presumed prince's bones were fragments that belonged to animals, chickens and sheep, and pieces of a third skeleton, possibly belonging to someone much older. The wooden chest had not been sealed. Over the centuries, other remains had somehow been added, or the bones had been disturbed, contaminated, confused. The analysis could not definitively prove these were the princes. It could not even definitively prove both skeletons were human throughout. Science had advanced since 1933. DNA testing could provide answers that Victorian and Edwardian scholars could only dream of. In recent decades, researchers have successfully identified the remains of Richard III himself, dug from beneath a car park in Leicester, confirming his identity through genetic comparison with living descendants. The same could be done for the bones in Westminster Abbey. Living relatives of the princes exist. Their DNA could confirm or deny, once and for all, whether England buried the right children. But every request has been refused. The royal family will not permit the testing. The bones remain in their marble urn, untouched, unexamined by modern science. The official reason given is respect for the dead, the sanctity of a burial place that has stood for over 3 centuries. But the refusal has spawned its own dark questions. What if the DNA revealed something unexpected? What if these were not the princes at all, but some other forgotten children, buried secretly for reasons lost to time? Or worse, what if they were the princes, and the DNA revealed something about their deaths or their bloodline that would rewrite everything we think we know? So the mystery deepens rather than fades. If those bones in Westminster Abbey are not Edward and Richard, then where are the real princes? Did their bodies lie somewhere else in the tower's vast grounds, under stones that have never been lifted? Were they taken from the tower entirely, buried in some unmarked grave far from London? Or could the most extraordinary possibility of all be true? Could they have somehow survived? Legends persist, whispered through centuries. Some historians have argued that the boys might have been smuggled out, hidden away by loyalists, their disappearance staged to protect them from whatever threatened their lives. Perhaps they lived out their days in obscurity, forbidden from ever revealing who they truly were. Every few generations, a new theory emerges, a new candidate proposed as the secret, surviving prince. None have been proven. All remain as phantom as the boys themselves. The Tower of London still stands, its stones holding secrets no historian can extract. Visitors walk past the bloody tower where the princes were last seen alive, and many report a strange feeling of sadness, of present. Are those simply suggestible minds filling ancient darkness with imagination? Or do some echoes truly remain imprinted on stone and air by unimaginable terror and grief? 500 years have passed since two boys were seen playing in a garden and then vanished from history. 500 years of theories, accusations, and unanswered questions. The bones that might be theirs lie entombed in England's most sacred church, forbidden from examination, wrapped in marble and mystery. We tell ourselves we want truth, that we seek justice even across the centuries, but perhaps some truths are too dangerous to uncover. Perhaps some silences are too deep to break. Can we ever know what really happened in that summer of 1483? Can we ever prove who lived, who died, who murdered, who survived? Or will the princes remain forever trapped, not in the tower itself, but in the far darker prison of history's uncertainty? Their voices have been silent for 5 centuries, and if we never test those bones, if we never seek the final answer, their voices will remain silent forever, calling out across time to ears that refuse to listen, trapped in an eternal mystery that we have chosen, perhaps, not to solve. The question hangs in the darkness, unanswered and unanswerable. Were those the princes in Westminster Abbey? If not, where do they truly rest? And if we fear the truth too much to seek it, what does that say about us? The tower keeps its secrets still. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.